Thanks for joining us on the Cultured Meat and Future Food podcast. We're excited to have Rabbi Joel Kenigsberg on the guest for today's episode. Joel Kenigsberg is a rabbi, educator, and researcher with a special interest in the application of ancient religious texts to modern technological innovations. He has presented extensively on this topic at international forums, including at Oxford, UCL, London School of Jewish Studies, and the European Conference of Rabbis, as well as published articles in both mainstream and academic press. He's also consulting with some of the leading companies in the cellular agriculture field. He holds an MA from Bar-Ilan University in the interdisciplinary field of science and Jewish religious law. He graduated from the Torah leadership program at the prestigious Eretz Hemdah Institute of Advanced Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, where he formed part of a team of scholars fielding cutting-edge questions from around the world. I had a great discussion with Rabbi Kenigsberg. Let's jump right in. Thanks for joining us on the Cultured Meat and Future Food Show. We're excited to have Rabbi Kenigsberg as the guest for today's episode. Rabbi Kenigsberg, I'd like to welcome you to the show.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your background and when you first started thinking about cell-cultured meat.
Thanks. Yeah, so I really got into this whole area of cell-cultured meat almost by accident. I grew up in South Africa. I moved to Israel when I completed high school, and I studied in yeshivot, rabbinical seminaries, for about 13 years. And one area that always fascinated me, in studying religious law, studying ancient religious texts, is how those texts are applied to modern technology, modern technological innovations, things which couldn't have been dreamed of years ago. And yet we have these ancient principles and rulings and how we apply them to these things. So I actually did a program in Bar-Ilan University in Israel. They have a master's degree. It's a program in science and Jewish law, looking at these different aspects, some medical things, some technological things. And that's where I first started learning about cultured meat, just researching as a research project. And around the time that I wrote a paper on this, there was a conference in the Technion in Haifa. This was about 2017. I think it was called The Path to Commercialization or something like that. And at this time, all this cultured meat really sounded very much like science fiction. And I went to this conference and realized, wow, this is really happening. And what I wanted to do was to bridge the gap between these two worlds, between the language of cultured meat, the science and technology on the one hand, and the world of religious law and text on the other, and bring these two things together. And that's how I started getting involved.
Great. And do you know what year that was that you first heard about cultured meat?
So this was in 2017. That's when this conference took place. When I started researching, so everything was about the hamburger. Mark posted the hamburger in 2013 that had been produced. And there were a couple of articles as well that had been written at the time, almost speculation. What would Jewish law say about this? Would it be kosher? Nobody took it too seriously at the time because it was still felt that it was science fiction. It was far off. And when we get there, we can talk about it more. The more I learned, the more I realized that we were getting closer. And there's really just been a tremendous explosion, as I'm sure all your listeners will be aware, in the last few years in this area.
Absolutely. 2017, we were really looking at it as science fiction. And now fast forward to 2020, 2021, now there are restaurants in Singapore serving it up. So let's definitely jump into that a little bit deeper. But before we do, I want to start off by asking some very basic questions. And that's, why do some religions have a set of rules for what can be eaten?
Sure. So I can't speak for other religions. As you know, my religion is Orthodox Judaism. And I think to answer that question, I'd say that religion is a way of life. We have a set of laws which encompasses the entire spectrum, from the moment we wake up in the morning until we go to sleep, the weekly cycle, the yearly cycle, what we eat, what we wear. It's all part of this religious practice, part of our ritual. I think maybe that's important to understand when it comes to kosher laws, the Jewish dietary rules and restrictions that we have, is that it's not necessarily about health. As some people think, there's a bit of a misconception out there that kosher means healthy. It's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it is more healthy. But the reason that we do all these things is because these are religious laws that we have. Interesting, I'll just mention as well, there's a separate commandment that we have to look after our health, not to do anything reckless, damaging, or dangerous. That's not necessarily what's behind the kosher laws.
So let's dig a little bit deeper. And I like to really call this the explain it like I'm 5 years old question. Give us the really basic answer for what does it mean for something to be kosher, or what does it mean for something to be parv? And I think I'm saying that right.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so kosher on a literal level means something that's going to be permitted for consumption. When we're talking about food, Jewish dietary law is very specific as to the things that we can eat, the things that we can't eat. Something kosher means it's permitted to be eaten. really two main considerations that go into that. One, we'd have to look at what the raw ingredients are of the food, and also the cooking process or the manufacturing process of how it's made that may have some effect as well. And that's regarding cultured meat, certainly, it's going to be significant. So when it comes to raw ingredients, a lot of the laws are, when it comes to animals or animal products, there are lists of conditions, in some cases a list of specific species which can be consumed when it comes to animals, when it comes to birds, when it comes to fish. Insects, I'll mention, are completely prohibited. Insects are not considered kosher. And for animals and birds as well, there's a process of ritual slaughter which has to be done. After that, the animal has to be salted as well in order to extract all the blood. Blood is forbidden for consumption under kosher laws. And then, of course, the process as well, when it comes to how the food is cooked, if we have equipment which has been used for non-kosher ingredients, which would then be used for kosher ingredients, that in many situations that would be problematic. And that could render the food itself non-kosher as well. There are also separate kosher laws regarding Passover. We'll skip those for now. Your second question, you asked about parav. So in addition to the products which are inherently kosher or non-kosher, there's a separate prohibition of the joint consumption of meat and milk. Actually, meat and milk, this is any product which is derived from, which contains meat or milk. They can't be eaten together. They can't be cooked together. In fact, according to our laws, one is not allowed to derive any benefit from a mixture of meat and milk together. So parav, I guess the best translation would be maybe neutral. It's a food that has neither the status of meat nor the status of milk. So it could independently be eaten with one or the other. So the most common examples, we talk about fruits and vegetables, bread, eggs. It may be surprising to some, but fish is also considered.
Interesting. Okay. So my favorite sour cream, which is called tofuti, which is a vegan sour cream, has that, I guess, parav label on it. And now it totally makes sense. So very cool. Okay. Very interesting. So now when we are thinking about cell-cultured meat and what we've been learning about the process of creating cell-cultured meat, is it possible for something like cell-cultured pork meat to be considered kosher?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think probably that's the two most common questions that people ask about this is, are we going to have kosher cell-cultured pork and are we going to have a kosher cell-cultured cheeseburger? That's what everybody wants to know. It's been widely debated. In fact, there were headlines a few years ago, you may have seen, it was doing the rounds in the media across the globe, that there was one rabbi who had suggested that maybe, this would be kosher and you could have kosher pork. Yeah, there were a lot of headlines about this idea of kosher pork. Personally, I don't believe we'll ever see it. I don't think that such a thing is possible. The simple reason is one of the principles we have in kosher laws is that anything which comes from an animal derivative takes on the status of the species from which it comes. As I mentioned before, we have kosher animals and we have non-kosher animals. Pork, pig is the most well-known example of a non-kosher species. And therefore, certainly the more conventional products that might come from a pig or come from a different non-kosher species would not be kosher. Things like milk, things like eggs, if they come from a non-kosher animal, they would not be kosher. And therefore, I think it's likely that we're talking about cell-cultured meat, which in a sense is derived from an animal, ultimately. That's where those cells come from. And I think it would make a lot of sense to say that those cells would retain the status, at least of the animal species from which they come. There is another argument to say that actually, even if it came from a non-kosher species, you might still deem it kosher. You might say that it began as a microscopic cell, and we have a principle that something which is microscopic, something which cannot be detected, unaided by the human senses, for certain elements does not have credence, does not have importance in Jewish law. So there are those who wanted to make that suggestion. And there are others who've wanted to say that this process, these cells undergo such a significant change through the process that might uproot the original status. But as I said, I think that when we look at the final product, which is going to be identical on a molecular level to meat, we're looking at a process which is completely natural, although it's done in a lab, and there's nothing supernatural going on here. And I think the result would have to be viewed the same way as that source animal. So I don't think we're going to have kosher cell-cultured pork.
Interesting. And you mentioned that the process that it goes through is also whether it is deemed kosher or not. So it might be a stretch to say that going from a cellular level of cell-cultured pork to perhaps a cell-cultured pork chop would be kosher. I would say that's definitely a stretch. But what about like cell-cultured chicken? I know that the process is important, but based off of the same thought, do you think that cell-cultured chicken would be kosher? Because I believe chicken can be kosher, right? So would cell-cultured chicken potentially be kosher?
Yeah, I think we'll get there. And the answer is it's not inherent whether cell-cultured chicken is going to be kosher or not. A lot is going to depend on the process, going to depend on how it's made, when the cells are extracted. I think the most significant question, Now, I mentioned that there are certain species which are kosher, certain species which are non-kosher. But even from a kosher species, chicken being one example, beef being another, that meat would only be considered kosher, fit for consumption, once the animal had undergone ritual slaughter beforehand and a number of other conditions. In a case where slaughter had not taken place, there is a separate prohibition of eating limbs or eating flesh from a live animal. We get into a fascinating discussion, fascinating debate. Those cells that are taken from a living animal, are those considered flesh in that sense from a live animal? If they are, then the entire product would not be kosher. On the other hand, not everything that comes from an animal, not everything that comes from a living animal is unfit for consumption. I mentioned milk before, I mentioned eggs. These are things which come from very much living animals, and they will still be kosher. So it's critical how this cell is going to be viewed. But I think certainly it's possible. Certainly if the cells were extracted after slaughter, then just about every authority will agree that it could be kosher by the end. If it's taken before, it may be a little bit more complicated, but there might still be ways to get there.
Great. And I think looking at the way we produce food today and thinking about whether cell cultured meat will be something that becomes mainstream and meets demand of meat consumption now, I think whether the animal will be kept alive or slaughtered is not really a question. I think most of these animals will probably be slaughtered, even if they are being used for cells at these initial stages. Although it is fascinating to think, the overall process will heavily dictate whether something is kosher or not. One question that just popped to mind, maybe a little bit off track, but how is seafood looked at? Is seafood considered kosher?
Yeah, so good question. Usually not. As I mentioned, in terms of species, when it comes to land animals, when it comes to bird, we have certain signs of what determines a kosher species or not. In a similar way, when it comes to fish, any fish which has fins and scales is going to be considered a kosher species, but anything else which lives in the water that doesn't fulfill that criteria is not going to be. So generally speaking, seafood would not be kosher.
Okay, great. So what is the ultimate authority that dictates the laws of new foods? And what are some examples of newer food technologies setting some of these laws as either kosher or not?
It's a great question as well, and it's one that we can ask not just about food technologies. Think about any technology. As I mentioned in the intro, one of the things that fascinates me is how we apply ancient texts, ancient laws, which are as ever relevant today as they were when they were given, how we apply them to these brand new technologies. And ultimately, we don't have just one centralized authority nowadays who will decide on this. I think in the Jewish world, in the Orthodox world, there are scholars, there are rabbinic authorities that are recognized after many years of study, recognized through their wisdom and their experience, and they're the ones who make these decisions. There are certain authorities who stand up above the rest. But when it comes to a question like this, something which is completely new, it's really highly unlikely that there's going to be just one authority making the decision by himself. This is something which is going to need a broad consensus, or as broad a consensus as can be reached from amongst the leadership of the Orthodox Jewish world. When it comes to the actual certification of the products, that's a slightly different matter. Talking about kashrut, as we mentioned before, you may have seen the labels on some foods. The OU, which is one of the certifying bodies, you see a U with a little circle around it on many food packages. Sometimes you'll see a K, sometimes you'll see different stamps or different labels from different certifying bodies. And each certifying body around the world has their own process, how they would go through an inspection of the factory, investigation of the methods that are used. They would look through the list of raw ingredients, and there would be some form of supervision as well. But what we're discussing precedes all of that. And of course, those certifying bodies have their authorities who they would consult with as well. But we're talking about the question of principle, of how do we view this product before we get to the actual supervision on the ground. And that's something that needs to be decided by the authorities, and as I said, probably by a group of authorities.
And so there would be a general consensus in place, and it wouldn't be such that the sour cream I have in the US does not get the stamp of approval, but in Europe, it does get the stamp of approval. Something like that does not typically happen, right?
Yeah, we Jews, we like to argue. There are differences of opinion, and it could certainly be that one certifying body will rely on one opinion and another certifying body will rely on a different opinion. And we do have things like that. But I think when it comes to cell-cultured meat, because it is so novel, I think everybody is going to try and reach the broadest consensus possible. And therefore, I think that whichever authorities will allow it, and those organizations giving that certification will rely on those methods that are going to be accepted by everybody.
What are the dangers of jumping to conclusions about whether something does fall under kosher law or not, on specifically for new food technologies?
Yeah, I think jumping to conclusions is never a good idea. At this point, there's still so much that's unknown. We look at the technologies of cell-cultured meat. A lot's unknown because the companies are keeping it secret at this point. A lot's unknown because it hasn't been developed yet, and nobody knows. To reach a correct conclusion, there's going to need to be a full and thorough understanding of the technology involved. So jumping to any conclusion at this point would be a problem. I think the greatest problem as well would be that when you make statements, you make decisions, if rulings are rendered now, it becomes very difficult to take those back. It becomes very, very difficult to change those. People will have a picture in their minds. People have a view of whether it's kosher or not. And even if the technology changes a little bit or things are understood in a slightly different way, by that stage it may be too late. The picture's already been established in people's minds. So I think on the one hand, we do have to wait. There does need to be a full understanding, as I said. On the other hand, certainly not too early to start having these discussions, to start putting policies in place, to start formulating those positions. I think if we're going to wait until there's a finished product, but then it will be too late. And it's important that there's a dialogue, and there is a dialogue already that's going on between some of the companies and some of the religious authorities in a way to make these products kosher. I'll say as well that type of cells matter and the process matters, and there could be nuances between different companies and different production methods. It may be that one company is producing cell-cultured meat that is kosher, that could be kosher. Another company may be producing cell-cultured meat that cannot be kosher. So that information is going to be important.
So stepping back a little bit and just thinking about diets and the religious law in general, would you say that if there was somebody who was vegan and didn't really consume any animal products, they would actually fit the profile for a lot of the dietary restrictions? And I guess a lot of the dietary restrictions are specifically around animal-derived products. Is that right?
Yes. So many of the restrictions are related to animals and animal products. And over the past few years, there's been a big tendency in the whole food industry to move away from animal-derived products where possible. And that has certainly allowed many more products to get kosher certification. But it's not exclusive, and it's certainly not automatic. There could be other questions, even when it comes to vegan products. I mentioned before that insects are forbidden for consumption. Sometimes fruit and vegetables, there are fruits and vegetables which could be infested, which could have insects inside. Those would not be permitted for consumption. Also, when it comes to agricultural produce, there are certain laws, certain restrictions. For example, the first 3 years, fruit from a tree is forbidden for consumption. Only afterwards would be permitted, and various other considerations. As I mentioned Passover earlier on, that's going to have its own whole set of laws as well. And that might be, even when it comes to cell-cultured meat, when it comes to the scaffolding, if there are wheat-based components or things like that, there's been a bit of discussion as to whether that may or may not play a role, whether it could be kosher for Passover. So yeah, supervision is still going to be necessary, even when we're talking about vegan products, but the concerns would be considerably less.
I see. Okay. And that's very interesting. And I guess for my own personal curiosity, kosher salt. What is kosher salt exactly? I'm a regular consumer of kosher salt. What is kosher salt exactly?
So that's interesting. Kosher salt is really salt that's used to make things kosher. Generally speaking, kosher salt is the coarser salt that you have as opposed to the finer table salt. Mentioned before that after an animal is slaughtered, in order for that to be kosher, all the blood has to be removed. And that's done. There are various methods. One of the methods of that is salting. So, this is the salt which is used, and I guess the name kosher salt. It used to be, going back not that long ago, that this koshering process would actually take place at home in the kitchen. Jewish housewives would buy your chicken or your meat, whatever it is, from the butcher, take it home, and the whole koshering process would take place in the kitchen. Nowadays, it's done prior to that, and we buy prepackaged kosher meat in the supermarket that's already undergone the whole process of koshering or kashering.
I'm starting to learn a lot, and it's starting to make a lot more sense. So thank you. So based on your experience, can you envision a world where foods are made from cellular agriculture and are consumed, and potentially otherwise traditional animal agriculture would no longer exist? So the slaughterhouses, etc. Can you envision a world like that?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. As I said previously, I don't think we'll come to a situation where we're going to have a kosher pork or a kosher cheeseburger or things like that. But I think that the cell-cultured meat can be kosher. I think we will have cell-cultured meat that's kosher. I think it's going to be considered meat from a religious perspective. There are those who want to argue that maybe the cell-cultured meat, it's not meat that's grown in the normal way, the natural way that we expect. It's an interesting question. In 50 years and 100 years' time, maybe this will be the normal way. But I think it's going to be considered meaty as well from all those perspectives. So if this does live up to its promise, cellular agriculture, it ends up bringing all the benefits that we hope that it will, then I think it's something that can and hopefully will be embraced by the religious community.
You can get in touch with Rabbi Kenigsberg on LinkedIn and check out his recent CMS 20 online presentation on YouTube. Rabbi Kenigsberg, do you have any last insights for our audience today?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, it's been great to be here, and it's very exciting to be part of this conversation, not just on this podcast, but this conversation which is going on. And I think There are a lot of misconceptions out there, both when it comes to cell-cultured meat, cellular agriculture, what it's all about, when it comes to kosher as well. But ultimately, I think this technology has a lot of promise. I think, as I've said, that we will see a kosher cultured meat product in the future. And the way to do that, the way to get there is going to be by bridging the gap between these two worlds, bridging the gap between the world of science and technology on the one hand, the world of religion on the other. And I think that gap is actually a lot smaller than many people might think.
Rabbi Kenigsberg, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your insight on the Future Food Show.
Thanks for having me.
This is your host, Alex, and we look forward to being with you on our next episode.